Today, I want to do a quick and dirty overview of the types of novels that we will be covering in adolescent literature class. You'll notice that the subtitle is a quick, dirty, flattened overview. I will probably speak a bit too quickly. I apologize. I may well get interrupted by my cat jumping on me, or you may hear the neighbor's dog bark. You may hear my Alexa reminder go off. I apologize in advance for all of those interruptions. But I do think it's important for me to talk about the types of novels and to give you an idea of what it is that we will be covering as we go through the 8 or 9 books that we're going to be reading during this class. If you look at the class course description, it says that the class will consider the cultural context within which this literature is read and literary subgenres including adventure, humor, historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, magical realism, dystopian fiction, realism, mysteries, and nonfiction. I don't know if we're going to get to each and every one of those. In fact, we may get to some that aren't on this list, but we're going to be looking very, very closely at how does this novel meet the definition of a mystery? Or how does this novel use magical realism? What makes this novel dystopian? So I think it's important to go through a whole pile of definitions, and I apologize if it just becomes a laundry list. I'll do my best not to bore you to death, and we'll kind of go from there. The first one I want to talk about is the realistic novel. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading it word for word, but realism is an attempt to be accurate to the life we live in the year of our Lord 2020, or to be accurate to the life that was lived whenever this novel was written. And it's going to talk about work, it's going to talk about pain, it's going to talk about suffering, it's going to talk about finding small joys in living. Characters are going to have warts, characters are going to have problems, and it's going to attempt to be realistic. And in fact, it might even be sort of pessimistic. One of the most famous short stories of all time is The Open Boat. The person who does most of the work in the open boat is the only one who doesn't swim to shore and live. There's a certain amount of depression that goes into realism, or not depression, but a certain amount of, let's see, I'm losing the word here. Realism is not always optimistic. I'll phrase it that way. In fact, it may be pessimistic. The first one we're going to look at is the picaresque novels. If you look at the picture and you're a Star Wars fan, Han Solo won the Millennium Falcon from Lando Calrissian gambling. These are eccentric characters. They are roguish characters. They are oftentimes on the run from the law. They are the sort of folk that people kind of love, but at the same time, if they're around too much, they're the kind people hate. And the picaresque novel will deal with eccentric or roguish characters. I think perhaps on the road trip, you might have a picaresque. One of the more famous picaresque novels, or novels that contains elements of the picaresque, includes Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, those sorts of novels. Uh, Paper Towns, like I said, may have elements of the picaresque in it. We'll talk about that as we go. The Bildungsroman, nearly all of the teen novels, nearly all of the young adult novels that we're going to read have the coming of age element. They achieve a level of psychological, spiritual, or moral maturity. And it doesn't matter if they're 11 or 27, they achieve that maturity during the course of the novel. Almost all of them that we read are going to have that. And even the nonfiction, the memoir that we're going to read, contains this element. It is a key focus of young adult fiction, and it would be important, or it would be kind of sacrilegious or negligent of me to not include that in this section. Detective fiction. There are two kinds of detective fiction. The first one was the one that began with uh, Edgar Allan Poe and his detective Dupin, and it was an amateur who seeks to solve a crime. He had unique powers of observation, and eventually he grew into being Sherlock Holmes. And again, you look at the picture, the Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes. There's reason, there's intellect, there's observation, and the focus of the novel is the reader's attempt to solve the puzzle. They attempt the whodunit along with the detective. And there are some red herrings thrown in the plot, there are some things to get people off track, but the focus of the traditional detective novel is indeed just solving the puzzle. There's also something called hard-boiled detective fiction. And in hard-boiled detective fiction, the character and the people the detective interacts with are the focus. The detective often will have an individualistic moral code, and it's not going to be a focus that deals with what's the puzzle. The puzzle is secondary to who are these people and who is this guy and why do I like this guy or why do I want this guy to win even if I hate him. And so when we look at Paper Towns, again, since that's the first novel we're going to read, if you look at the back cover, you'll see that it won an Edgar. That means it's a detective novel, but what genre, what subgenre does it fall into? And I just noticed that I probably should get rid of the hyphen and subgenre. I apologize for not proofreading more carefully. Romance. Just like the detective novels, there are two kinds of romances. There's the original romance, the knight in shining armor who undertook this adventure for the lady that he loves, and he never expected to have the lady return his affection. The most he would hope for was a look one day, or perhaps, if he were really lucky, he would get her handkerchief at the end of all of the things he did for her. That's the traditional idea of the romance. That's where the term officially came from. Obviously, in the year of our Lord 2020, we have the other kind of romance, the plucky heroine. The reader sympathizes with her. She's got this love interest. And usually there's a relationship that has some conflicts. Perhaps there's a former lover who shows up. Perhaps there's a class distinction where the woman is rich and the guy is poor, and her family doesn't want her to deal with the poor guy, or vice versa. The guy is rich and the woman is poor, and his family doesn't want her to deal with the poor woman. At the very, very end, usually, not always, but usually, love will conquer all, and everything will have the happy ending. This is a Hallmark movie sort of book. It is a formula. It is a step-by-step formula to get us to the very end. There will be elements of romance again. We're starting with Paper Towns, so I'm going to talk about that first. There are elements of romance in Paper Towns. Obviously, I think if we've read section one, Q obviously has a crush on Margot Roth Spiegelman. At the same time, I think we might want to take a look at the idea of the traditional romance as we go through it, because I think even Q as a narrator talks about himself in that traditional sense. Science fiction. Science fiction, again, has two sorts of elements to it. We think about Star Trek, we think about uh, movies like that or series like that. However, there are two kinds. And this one I want to emphasize a little bit more than the other is the idea of hard science fiction. Hard science fiction will be imaginative, it will be futuristic, it will have technology, but it won't violate the rules of science. There will not be faster than light travel. There will not be teleportation. There will not be perpetual motion. There will not be things that cannot be scientifically done. If you watch the movie The Martian, he grew potatoes on Mars, but he used fertilizer. He tried not to violate the rules of science. One can argue about the Iron Man stunt at the end of the movie, but nonetheless, hard science fiction is there are rules to science, and they will not violate the rules, especially when regard to time travel, faster than light, things that we believe are not possible scientifically. There's the Gothic novel. Gothic novels are all about things decaying, things falling apart. Wuthering Heights is a famous Gothic novel. Edgar Allan Poe was the creator of many Gothic settings, at least. The Fall of the House of Usher. It's going to have ghosts or other supernatural elements. It's going to emphasize shadows. It's going to emphasize the dark. And I think as we go along, we might look at, do some of the dystopian novels have elements of Gothic in them? Are there characters who seem to have a Gothic feel to them? Gothic novels, I think, have a long, rich history, and I think some young adult horror novels might have elements of the Gothic in them. Magical realism. Magical realism developed in South America in the 1960s, and it's going to mix the real and the fantastic. It is going to start out in the real world. I can't emphasize that enough. And then, some way or another, a magical element is going to be tossed in. For example, one of the most famous short stories is A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. The family has a sick baby. It is raining. Their house is close to getting flooded. And then this man with wings falls from the sky. They don't know what to do with him, and they put him in the chicken coop. And eventually he heals up and flies away. When we think of somebody falling from the sky, we think of fantasy, we think of angels, we think of all of that other sort of thing. That didn't happen there. It was a real world, and there were some little magical elements. We'll talk a lot about this magical realism when we get to Holes. I think Holes has elements of magical realism in it, especially with the time shifts, and it involves the myth, it involves the curse, it involves a lot of stuff that I think constitutes magical realism. Dystopia. Dystopia has bad crap happening. Utopia means everything is perfect. Dystopia means fecal matter has hit the whirling blades and bad crap has happened. And because this bad crap has happened, we have to have a hero or heroine or a group of heroes deal with the dystopian state, the dystopian situation. The Knife of Never Letting Go will be a dystopia. The Hunger Games will be a dystopia. Um, I think we could easily call The Marrow Thieves a dystopia. Those sorts of novels have been the most recent formula that has happened in young adult fiction, and I think a very, very important formula. And in 2020, we might as well look at a few dystopian situations because it's been a weird year. Fantasy. It's going to combine magical elements. It's going to combine supernatural creatures. They can be creatures from folklore, like the creature from the Black Lagoon, or werewolves, or Dracula and vampires, or whatever all else. And it's a real world, but it is not our world. Realism is always about our world. Fantasy is going to be another world, and the monsters are real. And there has to be a real rule about how the monsters can work. It's the same with magic. Magic has to have rules in all of these worlds in order to work. And so when we deal with a fantasy situation, everything is going to be real. It's just not going to be our world. Magical realism starts with our world, and then some magic pops into it. It's what distinguishes Harry Potter as a fantasy, even though they visit the Muggle world ever so often. And it certainly distinguishes a fantasy from real world realism, where there is no hope of this fantasy. There are no monsters. They're not jumping out of every corner. There is no creature from the Black Lagoon. There is no Loch Ness monster. Santa Claus will keep hoping for. Allegory. An allegory is a narrative in which the characters or events represent an abstract idea. We're not really going to read an allegory, but Allegories usually follow a quest. Allegories usually follow some sort of pattern. And because we're going to talk about the quest and we're going to talk about the pattern, we're going to talk about the idea that this allegory exists. Okay? And we'll talk about things being allegorical as we go through it. Sorry about that last sentence. It was phrased really badly, and I'm trying to do this in one take. All right, that seems to be the last type of literature we're going to talk about. I'm going to close this down, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me in class. Please feel free to stop by the office during office hours. Shoot me an email if you need to, and we're going to end this one right here. Thank you very much.